Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. What would you do if an HOA president you've never met tried to fine you $100 a day and then ordered the gate guard to deny you entry to your own home? I didn't yell or negotiate. I asked for one thing, and then everything flipped. Let me back up and explain the situation. My family has owned this little piece of land for 3 generations. It's just over an acre with a modest brick house built back in the 1960s. Nothing fancy, but it's been home for as long as I can remember. The land around us used to be farmland, stretching out for miles in every direction. Peaceful, quiet, and exactly the kind of place where you could sit on your porch in the evening and not hear anything but crickets. About 15 years ago, everything changed. A big developer bought up all the surrounding farmland to build some upscale gated community. They approached my grandfather about selling our property too, and I'll be honest, the number they offered was tempting. But this was family land, and my grandfather wasn't about to let it go. The developer kept pushing, coming back with higher and higher offers, but my grandfather stood firm. Finally, they reached a compromise. My grandfather sold them an easement that would let them build their main entrance road right through what used to be the public road leading to our house. In exchange, they had to guarantee us permanent access through their fancy new gate system. The whole thing was drawn up by lawyers, recorded with the county, and made legally binding. We got to keep our house and our acre, plus we got a pretty decent sum for the easement rights. The developer seemed happy enough with the arrangement. They got their main entrance where they wanted it, and we got to stay put. They even installed 2 remote clickers and gave us a permanent gate code that was hardwired into their system. Not a resident code that could be changed or revoked, but a property code tied directly to our deed. The lawyer explained it all very carefully at the time. This wasn't some courtesy they were extending to us. This was a legal right we now owned, just like owning the mineral rights under your property. For the first bunch of years after the community was built, everything went smoothly. The original residents knew the deal. Some of them had been there when the construction was happening and understood the situation. The HOA boards back then were reasonable people who had been properly briefed on the legal arrangements. They never bothered us, and we never bothered them. I kept our property looking nice, maybe even nicer than some of the houses inside the community, and everyone seemed content with the arrangement. But you know how it is with HOAs. Eventually, the reasonable people move on or get tired of dealing with the politics, and in comes a new crowd looking to make their mark. About 6 months ago, they elected a new board, and with it came a new president. I'll call her the president because that's how she introduced herself to everyone. Never just her name, always the president. She was one of those people who moved into the community a couple years back and immediately appointed herself the neighborhood watchdog. You know the type. Always walking around with a clipboard, measuring grass height, and taking pictures of anyone's Christmas decorations that stayed up past January 2nd. The kind of person who sees an HOA presidency not as a service role, but as a chance to finally have some authority over other people. I should have seen the trouble coming when I started noticing her patrol routes. She'd walk the perimeter of the community twice a day, morning and evening, always with that clipboard. Sometimes she'd stop at the gate and have long conversations with the security guard, gesturing toward different parts of the community. I caught her staring at our house a few times, and something about the way she looked at it made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the casual glance of a neighbor. It was more like she was studying a problem she intended to solve. The first sign of real trouble came in the mail about 2 months after she took office. I was going through the usual stack of bills and junk mail when I found this official-looking envelope with the community logo on it. Inside was a letter addressed to current resident announcing something called the Community Security Enhancement Program. According to the letter, the HOA had decided that all existing gate codes and clickers posed a security risk. They were implementing a new system where everyone would need to register in person, provide vehicle information, submit to being photographed, and receive a new trackable code that would be changed every quarter. The letter made it sound like Fort Knox was getting a security upgrade. The kicker was that attendance at the registration session was listed as mandatory, not requested, not encouraged, mandatory. The session was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community clubhouse, and anyone who failed to show up would have their access suspended until they complied. I read through the letter twice, then started laughing. It was clearly a mass mailing that had gone out to every address they had on file, including mine. The idea that they thought they could mandate anything for me was almost funny. I had a legal easement recorded with the county. My access rights weren't subject to their approval or their security programs. They could change their residence codes all they wanted, but my arrangement was with the developer and was locked in stone. I figured it was just sloppy record keeping on their part. Maybe they didn't have good documentation about which properties were actually part of their HOA and which weren't. It seemed like an honest mistake, the kind of thing that would sort itself out once they realized their error. So I tossed the letter in the recycling and didn't give it another thought. That was my first mistake. The following Saturday came and went. I spent the day working in my garden, enjoying the peace and quiet, while presumably half the neighborhood was sitting in the clubhouse getting their photos taken. I didn't give the whole thing another thought until the next week when I was driving home from work. I pulled up to the gate like I had hundreds of times before, but this time something was different. The president was standing right there next to the security booth, clipboard in hand, having what looked like an intense conversation with the guard. When she saw my car approaching, she immediately started walking toward me. I rolled down my window, figuring she wanted to say hello or maybe discuss the landscaping. I try to be friendly with the neighbors, even the ones who take their HOA duties a little too seriously. She didn't bother with pleasantries. The first words out of her mouth were about my failure to attend the mandatory registration session. She said she didn't have me on her list and wanted to know why I hadn't shown up to get my new security clearance. I explained politely that there had been a misunderstanding. My property wasn't actually part of the HOA, so their registration requirements didn't apply to me. I thought that would clear things up, but instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, she got this condescending look on her face. She told me that if I lived inside their gates, I was part of their community and subject to their rules. She went on about safety for their children and how they needed to know who was coming and going. Then she actually had the nerve to tell me I needed to turn around, park my car, and come to the clubhouse with her right then and there to get properly registered. I tried to stay calm and explain again that my access was guaranteed by a legal easement. I told her my arrangement was with the developer, not the HOA, and that I wouldn't be participating in their registration program. I thanked her for her concern, but made it clear that the conversation was over. The look on her face when I rolled up my window and punched in my gate code was something I'll never forget. It was like watching someone realize they'd just been told no by someone they expected to obey without question. The gate opened like it always did, and I drove through while she stood there staring after me with her mouth hanging open. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. 3 days later, I found a certified mail slip in my mailbox. I had to sign for the delivery, which meant taking time off work to get to the post office before they closed. When I finally got the envelope open, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a final notice of non-compliance, addressed to me by name. Not current resident this time, but my actual name and address. Someone had done their homework. The letter stated that I was in violation of community bylaws and would be subject to fines of $100 per day until I came into compliance. It also threatened to deactivate my gate access if I continued to refuse to register. The absurdity of the whole thing was staggering. Here was an organization trying to fine me for not following rules that didn't apply to me in the first place. It was like getting a parking ticket for a car you don't own, parked on a street you've never been to. I kept reading the letter over and over, trying to figure out if I was missing something obvious. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just a case of bureaucratic confusion. This was someone who had decided I was going to comply with their demands whether I was legally required to or not. Someone who saw my refusal to participate in their security theater as a personal challenge to their authority. The situation got even more ridiculous the following week when I found their monthly community newsletter slipped under my door. I don't usually read their newsletter since none of it applies to me, but something made me flip through it this time. Right there on page 2 was a passive-aggressive paragraph that was clearly aimed at me. It didn't mention me by name, but it talked about how disappointed the board was that one household continued to refuse to cooperate with their new security protocols. It went on about putting the community at risk and how the board was exploring all options to ensure full compliance. The whole thing was written in that special language HOA boards use when they want to sound official but really just want to shame someone into submission. The effect on the neighbors was immediate and obvious. People who used to wave when they saw me suddenly found other things to look at. Conversations would stop when I walked by. I could feel them staring at my house when they thought I wasn't looking, probably wondering what kind of person would endanger their children by refusing to register with the HOA. It was frustrating, but I tried not to let it get to me. These people didn't know the real situation, and they were just reacting to the spin they'd been fed by their board. I figured the truth would come out eventually and things would go back to normal. That's when the president decided to escalate things to a whole new level. I was coming home from a late dinner with friends when I saw the orange traffic cone positioned directly in front of the gate keypad. At first, I thought maybe there was some kind of maintenance work being done, but then I saw the security guard step out of his booth. The poor guy looked absolutely miserable, like he'd been dreading this moment all day. He walked over to my car window and started apologizing before he even explained what was happening. He said the president had given him direct orders not to allow my vehicle entry until I completed the registration process. He kept saying he was sorry and that this wasn't his idea, but that he had to follow the instructions he'd been given. Now, I've got nothing against security guards. They're usually just trying to do their job and collect their paycheck without getting involved in other people's drama. But this particular situation crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I looked at the guard and spoke very clearly so there wouldn't be any misunderstanding. I told him he needed to step away from the keypad because he was unlawfully impeding my access to my private property. I explained that if he didn't move, I would have to call the police to report the interference. I wasn't trying to be harsh with the guy, but I needed him to understand that this wasn't a request for a favor. This wasn't about HOA politics or community relations. This was about my legal right to access my own property being deliberately blocked by someone who had no authority to block it. The guard looked back toward the clubhouse, then looked at me, then looked at the cone. You could practically see him doing the math in his head. On one side, he had an HOA president who would be angry if he didn't follow her orders. On the other side, he had someone threatening to call the cops if he continued to block legal access to private property. It took him about 30 seconds to make his decision. He moved the cone, stepped back to his booth, and avoided making eye contact while I entered my code and drove through the gate. I felt bad for putting him in that position, but the alternative was letting the president think she could physically prevent me from reaching my own home. As I drove past the clubhouse, I could see her standing in the window watching the whole thing play out. Even from a distance, I could tell she was furious that her blockade had failed. But more than that, I could tell this wasn't over. Someone who was willing to block private property access wasn't going to give up just because their first attempt didn't work. That night, I sat in my kitchen thinking about how far things had escalated and how much further they were likely to go. The president had moved from demanding compliance to actually trying to enforce her demands through physical intimidation. She was clearly someone who saw compromise as weakness and retreat as unthinkable. I realized I was dealing with someone who would keep pushing until she either got her way or got pushed back hard enough to make her stop. Half measures weren't going to work. Being polite wasn't going to work. Hoping she'd see reason wasn't going to work. It was time to end this situation once and for all. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day digging through my family's old legal documents. Everything I needed was in a file folder my grandfather had labeled house papers in his careful handwriting. The original property deed, the easement agreement, the developer's access guarantee, and most importantly, the county recording information that made it all legally binding. I spread everything out on my kitchen table and read through it all carefully, making notes about the key points in legal language. The easement agreement was particularly detailed with specific provisions about perpetual access rights and remedies for interference. Whoever had drafted it had clearly anticipated that situations like this might arise and had built-in protections accordingly. The more I read, the more I realized how thoroughly the president had overstepped her authority. She wasn't just being unreasonable or difficult. She was actively interfering with legally protected property rights, and she was doing it in a way that could expose her and the HOA to serious liability. By the time I finished my research, I had a plan. Not a plan to escalate the conflict or get revenge, but a plan to end it definitively by making it clear exactly what legal ground everyone was standing on. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make the other side realize they never should have started one in the first place. I spent the rest of the afternoon crafting an email that would lay out the facts in language that even the most stubborn HOA board member couldn't ignore. The key was to be professional, factual, and absolutely precise about the legal realities of the situation. No emotion, no threats, just clear information about what the law required and what would happen if the law wasn't followed. The email went through several drafts before I was satisfied with it. The first version was too aggressive. The second version was too apologetic. The final version struck exactly the right tone. Respectful but firm, informative but not condescending, and crystal clear about the consequences of continued interference with my legal rights. When I hit send that evening, I felt like I was finally taking control of a situation that had been spiraling out of hand for too long. The president wanted to play games with authority and compliance. She was about to learn that some authority is real and some authority is just people with clipboards pretending to have power they don't actually possess. What happened next exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The response to my email was immediate and complete silence. No angry reply from the president, no defensive explanation from the board, no attempt to justify their position or negotiate a compromise, just absolute total silence. The morning after I sent the email, I drove to work expecting to see the president waiting by the gate with some new demand or threat, but the gate area was empty except for the security guard who gave me a friendly wave as I passed through. No orange cones, no clipboard, no confrontation. The silence continued for 3 days. No more certified mail, no more passive-aggressive newsletter entries, no more hostile stares from neighbors. It was like someone had waved a magic wand and made the entire problem disappear overnight. On Thursday morning, I found a different kind of letter in my mailbox. This one came from a law firm with a prestigious downtown address. The envelope was thick, expensive paper with the firm's letterhead embossed in gold. When I opened it, I found a single page with about 4 paragraphs of text. The letter was brief, formal, and to the point. It stated that the law firm represented the HOA and that they had conducted a review of the county records regarding my property. They confirmed that my property was not part of the HOA and was not subject to its bylaws or regulations. The letter concluded with a formal apology on behalf of the board for what they termed an administrative error and any inconvenience it may have caused. Reading that letter was one of the most satisfying moments I'd had in months. 4 paragraphs from a law firm had accomplished what months of explanations and reasonable discussions couldn't. The president had learned the hard way that there's a difference between the authority you think you have and the authority you actually have. But the real satisfaction came 2 weeks later at the HOA's monthly meeting. I had never attended one of their meetings before since I wasn't a member and had no business there. But this time was different. This time I had something to say. Not to the board, but to the community members who had been given false information about my situation. The meetings were held in the clubhouse on the 3rd Thursday of each month and were open to all residents. I wasn't a resident, but I figured they couldn't very well throw me out for showing up to a public meeting in a community where I had legal access rights. I arrived a few minutes before the meeting started and took a seat in the front row. I brought a folder containing copies of the easement agreement and the law firm's letter. Not because I planned to distribute them, but because I wanted them visible to anyone who was paying attention. The meeting room filled up with about 30 residents, which seemed like a good turnout for a Thursday evening. Most of them were the older, more established homeowners who had time to participate in community governance. A few were newer residents who looked like they were attending their first meeting. The president called the meeting to order from behind a small podium at the front of the room. When she saw me sitting in the front row, her face went completely pale. She started stammering through the opening remarks, completely lost her train of thought multiple times, and kept glancing at me like she expected me to jump up and start making accusations. I just sat there quietly with my folder in my lap, letting her imagination fill in the blanks about why I might be there. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up and say nothing. The meeting agenda covered the usual HOA business, budget discussions, landscaping contracts, maintenance schedules, and community event planning. Normal stuff that normal boards deal with in normal ways. But the whole time, the president seemed distracted and nervous, rushing through items that usually generated discussion and avoiding eye contact with anyone in the audience. When they reached the end of the regular agenda, she asked if there was any new business from the residents. Several hands went up with the typical complaints and suggestions. A street light that needed repair, a request to update the playground equipment, a proposal to change the pool hours. The president handled each item with obvious impatience, clearly wanting the meeting to end as quickly as possible. When the last hand went down, she started to adjourn the meeting without asking if there were any other matters to discuss. That's when one of the residents in the back row spoke up. She said she wanted to know about the newsletter article that had mentioned a security compliance issue. She asked if the problem had been resolved and whether the community was still at risk from whoever had been refusing to cooperate. The room went dead quiet. Everyone turned to look at the president, waiting for her explanation. This was the moment when she could have explained the misunderstanding, cleared the air, and restored the community trust that her actions had damaged. Instead, she muttered something about the matter being resolved and tried to move on to adjournment. But the resident wasn't satisfied with that non-answer. She pressed for details, asking who had been involved and what kind of security risk it had posed. The president looked around the room desperately, clearly hoping someone would change the subject or create a distraction. Her eyes landed on me for a moment, then quickly looked away. She mumbled something about legal advice and confidentiality, but even the residents could tell she was dodging the question. That's when I decided to help her out. I stood up slowly, folder in hand, and turned to face the audience. I introduced myself by name and address, which got everyone's attention since they all knew I was the mysterious non-compliant resident from the newsletter. I explained simply and calmly that there had been a misunderstanding about my property's relationship to the HOA. I told them my house had been built before their community existed and that I had legal access rights through an easement recorded with the county. I said the board had initially believed my property was part of the HOA, but that legal review had confirmed it was not. I thanked the board for resolving the confusion professionally and told the residents I was happy to continue being a good neighbor to their community. I sat back down without mentioning the fines, the threats, the blocked access, or any of the other harassment I'd endured. The room was completely silent for about 10 seconds while everyone processed what they'd just heard. Then the questions started flying, but they weren't directed at me. They were directed at the president. Why hadn't she explained the situation accurately in the newsletter? Why had she made it sound like someone was deliberately endangering the community? Why had legal advice been necessary for what sounded like a simple records check? The president tried to maintain control of the meeting, but it was clear she'd lost the audience completely. Her credibility was shot, her authority was questioned, her judgment was in doubt. The residents were polite but persistent, and it was obvious they weren't satisfied with her vague, defensive responses. I left the meeting early while the questioning was still going on. I'd accomplished what I came to do, which was to set the record straight for the community members who had been misled. What the board did with the president after that was their business, not mine. But word travels fast in a small community, and over the next few weeks I heard through various sources that the president's position had become untenable. Residents started asking questions about other decisions she'd made, other policies she'd implemented, and other situations where she might have overstepped her authority. 3 months later, there was a special election to replace her as president. The new board sent me a personal written apology that went far beyond what their lawyers had required. They acknowledged the harassment I'd endured and promised it would never happen again. More importantly, the neighbors started waving again. People I'd never spoken to before introduced themselves when they saw me working in my yard. Some of them even asked for advice about dealing with HOA overreach on other issues, having learned from my example that boards don't always have the authority they claim to have. The whole experience taught me something valuable about the difference between real authority and pretend authority. Real authority comes from law, from legitimate power, from actual responsibility and accountability. Pretend authority comes from clipboards and titles and the willingness to bully people who don't know how to fight back. The president thought she had real authority over everyone who lived behind her gates. She was so used to people complying with her demands that she never stopped to question whether her demands were actually legitimate. When she finally encountered someone who asked her to show the legal basis for her authority, her whole power structure collapsed like a house of cards. Looking back, I almost feel sorry for her. She wasn't evil, just someone who had gotten drunk on a tiny amount of power and lost perspective on what she could and couldn't control. Her downfall wasn't caused by malicious intent, but by the simple failure to understand the limits of her own authority. The irony is that if she had approached the situation differently from the beginning, none of this would have happened. If she had taken 5 minutes to research the legal status of my property before making demands, she would have discovered the easement and avoided the whole confrontation. If she had responded to my explanations with curiosity instead of condescension, we could have cleared up the misunderstanding without involving lawyers. But people like her don't ask questions when they think they already have all the answers. They don't do research when they're confident in their assumptions. They don't listen to explanations when they've already decided what they want to hear. The president was so obsessed with controlling who came through her gate that she never bothered to check who legally owned the road. She demanded my code for security purposes, but in the end, the only thing she exposed was her own incompetence. And I never had to raise my voice or lose my temper or resort to the kind of dramatic confrontation that makes for good television but bad real-world outcomes. I just asked her to show me the paperwork. Turns out that was the one rule she couldn't follow. The best part about the whole situation is how it ended, not with a big dramatic showdown, but with a simple question that exposed the fundamental weakness in her position. All of her authority, all of her demands, all of her threats were based on the assumption that she had the legal right to control my access to my own property. When that assumption was challenged and found to be false, everything else collapsed automatically. It's been 6 months now since the new board took over, and life has returned to normal. Better than normal, actually, since I now have a much better relationship with my neighbors than I did before the whole mess started. They've learned that I'm reasonable and willing to work with them on legitimate community issues. I've learned that most of them are decent people who were just reacting to incomplete information. The new HOA president is a retired engineer who understands the importance of checking facts before making decisions. One of the first things he did after taking office was to conduct a comprehensive review of all the legal documents related to the community, including easements, deed restrictions, and development agreements. He wanted to make sure they never again found themselves in the position of trying to enforce rules that didn't exist. He stopped by my house a few weeks after the election to introduce himself properly and to thank me for handling the situation as professionally as I did. He said he'd learned a lot from watching how I dealt with the conflict, and that he planned to apply those lessons to his own approach to board governance. We talked for about an hour about the challenges of managing a community where different properties have different legal relationships to the HOA. He was genuinely interested in understanding the history of the development and how the various access arrangements had been negotiated. It was refreshing to have a conversation with someone who asked questions because he wanted to learn, rather than someone who made statements because she wanted to control. As we wrapped up our conversation, he made a comment that really stuck with me. He said that the best HOA boards are the ones that residents barely notice because they handle their responsibilities quietly and effectively. The worst boards are the ones that try to insert themselves into every aspect of community life and turn routine administration into opportunities for personal power trips. That observation pretty well summarized the difference between his approach and his predecessor's approach. She had seen the HOA presidency as a chance to impose her will on other people. He saw it as a chance to serve the legitimate needs of the community while respecting everyone's legal rights. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, and the results spoke for themselves. Under her leadership, the community had been divided, suspicious, and constantly embroiled in conflicts over petty rules and arbitrary demands. Under his leadership, people actually looked forward to community events and participated constructively in board meetings. It made me realize that the real problem hadn't been the HOA as an institution, but rather the particular individual who had been running it. HOAs can actually serve useful purposes when they're managed by people who understand the difference between leadership and authoritarianism. The key is having board members who see their role as serving the community rather than controlling it. These days, I barely think about the whole gate code controversy unless someone brings it up. My access has never been questioned again. My relationship with the neighbors continues to improve. The security arrangements work smoothly for everyone involved. It's exactly the kind of peaceful coexistence that should have been possible from the very beginning. But every now and then, when I'm driving through that gate after work, I think about how close the situation came to spinning completely out of control. If I had responded to the president's demands with anger instead of research, if I had tried to escalate the conflict instead of documenting my legal position, if I had let her drag me down to her level of petty power games, the outcome could have been very different. The lesson I take from the whole experience is that the most effective way to deal with illegitimate authority is not to fight it directly, but to expose it by asking simple questions that reveal its fundamental weaknesses. When someone claims to have power over you, the most powerful response isn't defiance or submission, but rather a calm request to see the source of their supposed authority. Most bullies, whether they're playground tyrants or HOA presidents, count on their targets being too intimidated or too uninformed to challenge their claims of authority. They create an atmosphere of fear and confusion where people comply with unreasonable demands rather than risk confrontation. But when someone finally asks them to justify their position with facts and evidence, their whole facade often crumbles immediately. That's exactly what happened with the president. She had gotten so used to people obeying her demands without question that she never developed the ability to defend her positions when challenged. When I asked her to show me the legal documents that gave her authority over my property, she couldn't do it because those documents didn't exist. And once that became clear to everyone involved, including her own board and the community she served, her credibility was permanently destroyed. The really satisfying part is that justice was served not through dramatic confrontation or legal warfare, but through the simple application of facts and reason to an unreasonable situation. The president defeated herself by overreaching her legitimate authority and refusing to acknowledge her mistake when it was pointed out to her. All I had to do was ask the right questions and wait for the truth to speak for itself. And in the end, that truth was simpler and more powerful than any argument I could have made. Some people have real authority based on law and legitimate responsibility, and some people just have clipboards and bad attitudes. The difference becomes obvious as soon as someone bothers to ask for documentation. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So a few years ago, I've got the most a-hole boss one could ever have. To give some context, this manager is on his 50s, almost 60s, still preying on younger employees, and that includes me. He tried to charm his way to me, but then he learned quickly that I got a boyfriend at the time, so then he started to start a hate campaign towards me, lol. Keep this in mind. Before I met this manager, I worked for the company for almost 2 years. I resigned, but this manager is new in the company when I am almost done serving my notice period, and he stopped me from resigning and offered me a retail manager position. I accepted since it's more pay, less hours, and good for experience. Anyway, back to present. When this boss started his hate campaign, one of his things is that he hates to see me sitting on my desk trying to do my job. That is making weekly schedules for the retail, resolving complaints, creating proposals for retail improvement, etc. For him, working means being on foot and actually literally moving from place to place. I should add to context that during his hate campaign, he also added my tasks. Apart from retail manager, he also unofficially appointed me to be a quality control checker, so two opposite jobs. I DK really what to do at that point because I tried doing quality checking, but then I can't also at the same time do some paperwork and focus on retail, so my position got compromised. He always yell at me when he see me on my desk. Even if I am doing my job, I wouldn't let that happen, so I devised a way to show him what it means if he wanted me to do what he wants. I do the scheduling and the proposals during my break time, send it to him for approval, and do quality checking, and making sure he sees me doing quality checking most of the time. Now, I deliberately send the schedules and proposals to him, and as expected, he did not read it. He barely even read a simple message, so I waited for him to yell at me for neglecting my retail manager duties. Surprisingly, he did not yell at me. Instead, he called a meeting with the owner of the company and the director to publicly humiliate me during the meeting. He claimed I had failed to do my job as a retail manager and that he wants to fire me. Unbeknownst to him, my emails had the owner, the director, and anyone important to the company CC'd on it. Now it's his turn to be humiliated, not even reading the email and now claiming I failed to do my job. I then explained to all the boss what I was tasked to do and why I did what I did. The boomer boss got fired, I got a raise, but I still left the company after a few months for different opportunity. Anyway, thank you for watching.